brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village at Britain, the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
All right, guys, so we are starting on episode 53 and we are doing origins of hospitality. Still, again, however you want to call it. If you hear loud barking, whining, and otherwise inappropriate behavior, that's because we have the Shen, who is my puppy. Here.
Oh, I thought that'd be me.
Aren't you adorable? Sorry, the Shen is still cuter. Yep, he's 6.5 months now. He's getting his masculinity. So guys, would you be willing to indulge me by watching a really old, kind of adorable and funny Russian cartoon, Soviet cartoon, I should say, for first couple of minutes of our episode, because A, it's goddamn cute, gosh darn cute, and B, it is, there's going to be elements in that cartoon that are going to be relevant to our discussion. Though this is a Soviet cartoon on Slavic mythology, late Slavic, not even mythology, Slavic fairy tale characters. It was the Soviet slant. Now, before we start, I just got to explain who these characters are. Baba Yaga, I'm sure a lot of you guys heard about this lady. She is the woman who lives in the house on chicken legs. And she is kind of the undead or dead ancestor. She is also the gatekeeper between the worlds. She's a very archaic character. She's an old woman or an undead person, or sometimes a fertility goddess, usually depicted as a very terrifying looking old hag with a very long nose and one leg that's made of bone. She eats little children. There are such characters as swan geese. The swan geese are usually her servants. Swans in the Slavic folklore is a very dark character. Swans are harbingers of death. Then there's going to be the character called Kashey, and he is the only knight-like character. He's also a lake character in the Slavic folklore. He's an undead kind of Skeletor type knight who is undead, and he likes gold and young pretty princesses. He tends to steal them. And the fourth character that is very major, very archaic in the Slavic folklore is Zmei or serpent, Gorыныch. He is a fire-breathing three-headed dragon. So those are going to be our three, Baba Yaga, then there's going to be the cat, and then the other two that are actually kind of prominent characters. So here, and a Soviet young pioneer. Now, a pioneer organization in Soviet Union, for those who don't know, it was equivalent to Boy Scouts here in the United States. It was very pragmatic, very modern looking, very handsy, very leadership oriented, survival, self-reliant, kind of upbeat young boys and girls. So here it goes. Keep your eyes open for the interior of the house. With the house we're going to be entering is not going to be a typical house, but it will have some typical elements. Now, the name of the cartoon is Ivashka or Ivan. Ivashka is just little Ivan from the Pioneer Palace. Now, Baba Yaga, she lives in a house on chicken legs. We will talk about what that house is, but this is basically a kind of an anti-house. It's typical Russian folk house, village home, but this is the antipode of the home. So here we go. So that's the little cute cartoon. I just want to show you guys a couple elements of her house here. We're just going to skip through some of the so you notice that her house, besides the fact that it's on legs, which we will talk about separately, it has no entrance way. You know what I'm saying? It has no space in the front. It's the door goes straight in. Normally in fairy tales, it will also never have a window. You see that it's made out of logs. There's the logs that go perpendicular to the door, and then there's logs that go parallel to the door. Note that. We were talking about architecture earlier and the imagery of horse in the architecture. See, she's clean. That's kind of, I mean, it's decrepit, but it's that horse. And there's that central log of the home with the horse head on it. Okay, now if we look at the stove right here or the oven, so it has this area, the shelf right here. Nowadays, it's usually used to store kitchenware. It has the mouth, and it's called the mouth of the stove. There's a large area behind the chimney where a person sleeps, and then there's usually an area behind the stove or oven or whatever you call this in English language, which is the woman's traditional space. We'll talk about the woman's and the men's space here. There's usually a table, and it's kind of indicated here, that not very well, but this would be the table that's in the center of the house. If you notice, the table runs parallel to the long logs in the house, and also parallel to the central log. This is the area that would usually be the woman's area right here. It's kind of the storage area, and also it's the only private isolated area within one of these houses. That's the woman's private space. Nobody but the wife, the lady of the house, not even her daughters go in there. Nobody is allowed to go there without her, because that's where she prepares, for example, her dough. And if it's believed that somebody enters there without permission, they will curse themselves. So you see how people sleep. I mean, these things were most of the time in the cold winter, because this whole thing is made out of stone. It's over half of the entire building. The entire family would be sleeping right there. Because it, of course, would keep warm. It's made out originally from stone, cobblestone, then brick. And covered in clay, of course, and so on. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments before we go any further?
Well, I did think that the stove that was presented in that cartoon, as you describe it, taking up a tremendous amount of space in the home, I think that's kind of interesting, because that would have been very effective. The whole thing is basically a thermal flywheel to keep everybody warm after the fire goes out. So that's kind of
That's
neat.
exactly it. There were heat and cooking and everything, and life centered around the oven and stove.
Right, right.
Yes, and from what I understand, those stoves are very, very thick, so they radiate heat all through the night.
Yeah, that fire, like the coals never ever go out. So if we get interested in the subject, there's a lot of things I can say about the space and the territory of one of those houses. Now, I want everybody to be aware that we're talking about, we're going to start with hospitality. I don't know how far we're going to get with this, but I'm going to start at the very beginning. And I'm, of course, going to be going mostly of Slavic folklore, more over Russian folklore, ethnography, and mythology, and various folk traditions. Because, first of all, that's material I obviously know the best. He wants to get into his thing. And second of all, because it is material you will not, I guarantee you, there's nowhere else you will see that material under any circumstances. So first, before we start with any of that, I want to tell you a story. Once upon a time, there lived a big and happy family. There were 3 brothers who had, each one of them had a beautiful wife. Now, 1 or 2 of the wives, I don't remember the exact number, happened to be a blood sister to the brothers. And then the other 2 wives were something like second and third cousins. And of course, they had beautiful children. There were some teenage kids. There were some, kids, that were like youngish, and then there was a couple babies. They lived a happy, healthy, almost I'd say hippie kind of family, because they were vegetarians and they did not like to, socialize with a lot of strange people. But one day, so it happened that a group of guests came to their happy abode. And nowadays, this was about 50,000 roughly years ago. This family happened to be Neanderthals, and they all got eaten, all of them. And the reason why we know so much about these people is because they're chopped up, defleshed bones. Everybody from the males to the females to the baby were found dumped by whoever were the happy visitors that came to their homestead. And that's where begin the story of hospitality. Most likely were Neanderthals as well. And that probably explains why these Neanderthals preferred to marry their sisters, rather than go far out and encounter possibly not very friendly other groups that might do exactly what happened to this whole entire family. About 12 people total were killed. Like I said, adults, children, an elderly person, everyone. So the word hospitality, it is a word that shares the roots. The root of that word is shared with such words, of course, as hostel, hospice, hospital, host, hospitality, of course, hostage, and hostility. The reason why, and as a matter of fact, the word guest is also from the same root, though it went through different, kind of migratory routes to come to its present spelling, but it's all the same basic root of a word that meant both 2 things. It meant stranger and it meant enemy. It meant dangerous other. And that's what really the idea of a guest, of a visitor, always meant to the people in the beginning of time. You lived in, so a long time ago, people lived in small groups and they did not venture far outside of their little microcosm. And the thing that people started doing very early on, when they first separated themselves from nature, they decided to organize their own microcosm that they could control, because nature around us is chaos. Nature around us is full of predators and various dangers. It's also full of things we don't understand, of spirits, of ghosts, of others, of strangers, of the dangers. And so in the microcosm of a household, every little community started modeling the universe. Now, of course, I'm talking about agriculturists here already, or maybe it's some of these traditions are extremely archaic. And so they hearken to very ancient times, but we're still talking about agricultural societies. Russian izba, this particular kind of a household, the very simple one, like the one we just saw in the cartoon, it's called an izba. Originally, these, of course, were very small dwellings. Moreover, originally they were dugouts. They didn't have any windows. They only had a door. They had either the heath, which pretty soon got covered by stones to keep the entire structure safe. And they also were very kind of huddled, like there was not a lot of space there. So they only contained very few, very necessary items in them. And each one of those items had a meaning to it. Each one of these items was absolutely essential. Each one of these items had a sort of representation to it. Of course, we know that in a lot of cultures, any living space it doesn't matter if it's a nomadic culture or it's a settled culture, whether it is northern culture, southern culture, whether it is in Papua New Guinea or Slavic lands, or whether it's Germanic world, there's one primary division that any dwelling has in it, and that is between female and male sides of the house. And that is very important. We'll talk about it later. So this is your space of your basic izba. This is obviously modern, very modern design, but we have certain features that are always features there. And, if you think about traditional Scandinavian house as well, log house of any kind, it also has a very similar structure. Here's another image of the same thing. So izba itself, the space, the living space of it is just this area right here, right? That's where people live. And this is the female section. There's the male section. This is the entrance. Okay, so here's the entrance. So the house sits a little bit above. This is above the ground. This is the floor plan, right? There's always the entrance, and then there's the area that's below the floor, and that's the third space that appears in settled homes only. It does not exist, of course, in nomadic cultures. This is the primary living space. This is what's the izba itself. This is where people live. This right here is where you store your hay for the animals. It's usually right here. This right here is where you keep your animals. It's also under the house. And this right here area is not really considered to be a part of the house yet. So when you enter the house, do you see how it has a structure? So you have the underworld right here, right? You enter through, this is basically your limbo, your gate. And you either go over here where you have your stored hay and stuff like that, or you go through to, and you see this door is really small, really low. You have to bow to walk in. You go in and you are facing the main living space. The main living space right here, this right here is where usually there's wooden boards or whatever put down. It's right behind the stove. Now remember the stove can be very big, it can be small, but right here is where children sleep, or children sometimes sleep on the stove itself. The parents will sleep there. The area right here, the little area right here beneath those boards is the woman's space. That's the storage space / the magical space where she will be making her dough that nobody is allowed to enter. Right across from the door and parallel to usually this table would be sitting parallel actually to the door. This is the men's. So if you take the house and you divide it like this, because the only living space really is right the square right here, right? Everything else is additional space. Right here will be our divider. This is called the light part of the house. That's the men's part. This is where the men sits. This is where the guests are welcome. This part of the house is the woman's space. Now, if you look at the stove, if you look at the oven, what is the first thing that comes to mind here? I mean, this is the womb. This is the womb of the house. Usually in the household, there would be 2 fires burning always. There's the thing that's called a red corner, which of course in the Christian tradition, There's another image of this. In Christian tradition, the red corner is where the images of the saints and of Jesus and so forth would be kept. And that would be lit by special sacred fire. In Christian tradition, it would be a fire that you'd bring home from the church. The oven right here would have a different fire, but the coals in the oven never were allowed to go out. And that was the ancestral fire. So, for example, if a person moved from one household to another household, they would bring those coals with them. If they didn't, then the new house might be hostile to them. But that's just a little bit of an idea of what, so we know what we're talking about as we're moving forward. So the very first, of course, thing that we had as the very first kind of dwelling the peoples would have been basically some sort of a structure. It doesn't matter how it's made, but basically it's a roof, entrance, nothing else, right? And some sort of a heath, nothing else in that particular dwelling. So our main boundary between the dangerous outside world where monsters and ghosts and the undead people roam and neighboring Neanderthals who might come and eat you and your children, your door is the border boundary. It is that sacred divide between us and them, between the world of people and the world of monsters, the world of spirits, the world of the unknown, of the dangerous. And anything that comes to you from across the other side is a very potentially dangerous entity. It is a stranger in the worst sense of the word. It is an unknown. When you have, so let me back up. So the reason why I think the Slavic folklore is a very good source for some very archaic understanding of at least agricultural beliefs, not only of the peoples of the Indo-European origin, such as the Germanic peoples, and some of the things I'll be telling you will sound kind of foreign to you, but some of them you will hear echoes of or suddenly see echoes of in modern, even American traditions. Very, very vestigial, very, very trace echoes of these. But because the Slavs were so far away and so far on the outskirts of the Roman Empire and the civilized world, because they were isolated from the Christian tradition for a very long time, comparing to Western Europe, for example. What they managed to do is they maintained a lot of that very, in mythology, there's the lower mythology and then there's the high mythology. So basically there's high mythology and low mythology. High mythology is like in a kind of pre-Christian tradition is like various gods and things, but the lower mythology, your dryads, your satyrs, to use Greek, your nymphs and so forth. They're the small creatures that are responsible for the stuff around us that are not gods per se, but they're not really people. That sometimes they're hostile, sometimes they're not hostile. But Slavic tradition and even today modern Russian rural tradition has maintained, heck, not even rural, even city tradition, despite the several revolutions, despite the several wars, despite the 70 years of communism, a lot of that got retained, and it's so deep in the Slavic psyche, and it's so close to what we used to share with the Balts, we used to share with the Germanic peoples, and before that with a lot of other European peoples. We will see traces of that in Greek worldview, that it's almost like a repository of some of those very early beliefs, at least when it comes to forest people or people of Europe in general, and Eurasia to a point. So that's why I think it's not only my favorite, and not even my favorite, just something I know best, but it's also a very good source to go to. So your stranger is basically an enemy, potentially. So if you're going to have a person come into your household, and that person is desirable because even though they may be very dangerous to you and your family, they may also be very advantageous, because if you do what those Neanderthals did in Spain and you continue to marry your sisters and cousins generation after generation, you're going to have the same genetic problems that those poor Neanderthals had before they got eaten. Spinal deformity, all kinds of other congenital defects, and so on and so forth. So it's good to have fresh blood sometimes, and it's good to just in general have new innovations, ideas, all kinds of stuff brought to you. So you have a creature at your door, and there's a couple things you have to do. First of all, you need to make sure that this, in fact, is a person and not a thing. There's different ways of checking for that. The other thing you need to do is you need to take this alien thing and make it part of you, turn it into them, not them, but now us. How do you make sure that this is not a monster? This is not something pretending to be a person. This is not an imposer. I talked last time, for example, how in Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian and so forth tradition, you offer them bread separately, but salt separately, because salt is believed to be dangerous to creatures that are not human. There's other things, for example, in some, there's vestigial echoes of this tradition in Russian fairy tales where a guest will come to the house and the wife will drop something and look under the table to see if he or she has hooves. So you always have to be very careful to find out whether or not the thing that's coming to you from the other side, because anything outside the door is the other side of reality. It's dangerous. Just to illustrate that, for example, to what degree they saw that as the dangerous other side. For example, there was such a thing that's recorded by ethnographers, and this is all late 20th, early 21st century, where, for example, in villages, if a child was born, not very healthy and unwell, then the mother would sit by a window, because we will talk about windows a little bit more, but she would sit by a window, which is also became kind of another passage into the other world, into the other life, because it's yet another hole or another opening in the security of your household. And she would wait for the first stranger to walk by. She would call the person near to the window, and she would hand the child out the window to that person and basically sell the child for a penny. And then she immediately would go to the door and buy the child back. Now, why would you do that? Well, how can you make anything that is alien, that is foreign, a part of you? You have to, how do the creatures from the other side come into this world, and how do people from this world go to the other side? Anyone? You have to die, right? If you're a living creature, you have to die, right?
Yeah. It's a symbolic death.
Right.
And you have to cross the threshold.
Cross the threshold, exactly. So the death ritual, now, what is one of the main aspects of initiation rituals? Because initiation rituals oftentimes are the same way of crossing a threshold. You ritually die and you are reborn as a new type of a member of the community. So what is the main thematic subject within 99%, let's say, of initiation rituals? How do you die? What do you have to go through to be reborn?
In baptism, which is the same thing, you go through water.
But in more traditional cultures, anyone?
Well, for me, it's like a tunnel, a natural tunnel, and something natural that's made by nature. But then there's another one too, where in the old days, if someone died in a hogan, you would break open the north wall and transport them out the north.
Right, north, not south.
Direction.
Right. Okay. So one of the main ways in shamanism, for example, that shamans, you eaten, you're consumed, you are dismembered, and you are ingested.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a loss of self, a loss of self-identity.
But but it's also food. Now, food is a very sacred thing for humans since the dawn of time. Because if you think about any pack living animals, any group living animals that are predatory, or, humans are basically predatory, opportunistic predator group living, the sharing of food within the pack, within the group, is a very bonding experience. We could go all on the whole subject of feasting and so forth, but the idea of, for example, why does a mom and dad always sit down and eat the dinner with the family, right? Because sharing the food together, it is a bonding ritual. In a pack of wolves, if a strange wolf comes and tries to join the pack, whether or not that animal is allowed to partake of the pack's meal is what determines whether or not that animal is a stranger or is one of us, right? So for humans, the sharing of food has become an extremely essential aspect of acceptance and of bonding. By the same token, we are what we eat. So if we presume that we live in a safety shelter and around us is the world of ghosts, monsters, and alien creatures, right? And we want to make them one of us. So if a fairy tale character from this, like a epic hero, winds up going to the underworld, one of the main things what are you not ever supposed to do if you are in the afterlife, besides looking back, which is a given? What are you not supposed to be when you're visiting the other side?
You don't eat the food there. Yeah,
Right.
You don't eat the food there, yeah.
Because if you partake of the food or the drink, you will be left there forever. Therefore, it is essential, absolutely essential, and life preserving is to get this stranger to consume your food. Which is why even today, you have a repair technician come over. Would you like a glass of water? We think of it as common courtesy. But I personally, and I'm sure a lot of people more modern than myself, don't get kind of weirded out by it. But if I've got a Comcast cable guy over at my house and I offer him, he won't take anything, even a glass of water, I start getting nervous. Because there's that, because on the more cognitive, in the more cognitive sense, to break bread with someone is basically reassurance that you have no hostile intentions, at least right now. If a guest refuses to eat in a household, that guest is refusing to be a part of that household. They're refusing to be a part of that microcosm, and they are a danger to the inhabitants. By the same token, if the host does not offer anything to a visitor, it's also a declaration of hostile intentions. But once you broke that bread, at least for the duration of that visit, however long it may be within a culture or this particular circumstances, that guest is in fact your family member. Not only are they your family member, but they're your most cherished family member. I'm going to stop and see if anybody wants to jump in with anything real quick. Is this interesting stuff to you guys?
Yeah, I did enjoy the cartoon earlier, by the way. I thought that was kind of fun. But I have to say, on that note, if somebody doesn't, as a host, if you don't offer somebody something, it's kind of a hostile intention. There was somebody that was an uninvited and unwelcome guest, and I basically did that to them. I wanted him off of the property, and so I did not offer him anything.
And that's exactly what that means. Exactly, that's exactly what that means. Now, in most cultures, whether it's steppe cultures, it is, whether it's forest cultures, whether it's settled or nomadic cultures, 99% of the time, again, hospitality is a sacred right, especially as we talked last time, in cultures where, in peoples where the life is particularly difficult, when there's scarcity of resources, where, nomadic cultures or poor environments where at any point in time you may be in need of support in case you're wandering in the far off lands. But also it is a way to bring that fresh blood into what used to be static small communities. It's very, very essential. Homo sapiens did a little bit better than Neanderthals as far as all that goes, but Neanderthals seem to have had pretty darn good reason to not want to allow strangers into their households much. So I've talked about food as a way of converting the alien, the strange, into your own, making it a part of your household. Now we need to talk about the house and the danger of the house represents to the guest, because not only is the guest a danger to the house is a danger to the guest. Now, there's a saying, for example, in Russia, and I think there's similar sayings in other cultures, that is that goes along the lines of a house is always built on someone's head, on someone's blood. That is because traditionally it has been, and I'm sure in a lot of cultures, not just Indo-European, a house is an anthropomorphic sort of entity, whether it's a yurt again, whether it's any kind of a structure. If you have a dwelling that is ongoing, if you don't build a new one, every couple of weeks, if you have an ongoing domestic dwelling, it takes on certain anthropomorphic traits. I mean, if you think about how kids always draw the house, you have two eyes, then it's a face, right? There's a part of it that's usually referred to as the head. There's a part of it that's usually referred to as a mouth in different cultures. It is a creature. It is a living being entity. And that entity has to have a soul, and that soul has to come from somewhere. Now, we've all heard the Western European stories of somebody being entombed in the walls, for example, of a castle, right? I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of traditions in various, not just Eastern, but Western European cultures, where you at least sacrifice a chicken or in some case a rooster, a horse. And of course, early on, it was most likely human sacrifices that had to go at the base of the house to inhabit the house, to give it a life, to give it a soul. It is believed to this day in villages in far North Russia that if you build a new house, if a family builds a new house, that year somebody in that family will die. It is believed that a new home consumes a human soul, and that is a fact if you don't properly approach it. Any comments or thoughts?
Well, I have to say, my father is actually a master carpenter. He knows a lot about building houses, and it is definitely obvious to me that when somebody that has that much drive, in their being, when they set out to build a house, they are building like a living thing almost in their eyes.
They put a tree in the front, like what had been a living tree, and that's their tradition, which I've actually seen done in Canada as well.
That's a slightly different tradition, actually. That's another tradition. That's the tree of life. In early Slavic homes, that would be the supporting beam in the center of the house. So that's actually the tree of life. That's what that's supposed to. That's the mother. You know how I was talking about that horse beam, that center beam that goes across the roof? That's the male, and then there's the female. The tree is the female part. Now we'll talk about sacred spaces and spaces that a guest is not welcome to. But back to, so we have a guest who is foreign and potentially hostile to this inner space, and the space is dangerous to the guest. It is dangerous to the guest. Moreover, if we remember back to some of the archaeological cultures we're talking about, where people were literally burying their ancestors under the floor of the household.
Regarding spirits of the house, we have an idea what we call an in-standing one. There's the physical material part of anything, but then that material part is given life by a spirit called the in-standing one, which gives it its purpose. But then the in-standing one, or that spirit, is given power and life through the creator, or the power of the creator.
Right.
So everything has a soul, like a spirit.
Right, and I was talking to David about it. So, for example, in Russian household, there are different spirits, and I'm going to very loosely translate their names. So the house spirit is called, basically, I'll call him Hausnik. But then there's a kind of like a bath Hausnik. There's a, Barnik. There's a Yardnik. But I want to talk about the creature that in Russian folklore is known as Domovoy or Hausnik. He's depicted in different ways. This is a neutral creature. He's tied to the house, but this creature is believed by many to represent. He kind of looks like Shen and behaves like Shen, okay? Basically, and about the same size as the Shen, except he walks on hind legs and wears clothes. But the Hausnik is basically the spirit of the ancestor, of that soul of the house, and that spirit is protective of those people of the family who resides there. And that's why you meet your guest right out front of your household and you offer them the food. The same reason as we talked last time, you carry the bride over the household, because you have to get them over that dangerous divide, over the threshold, to keep them safe from the spirits within attacking them. And of course, if the mother spirit of the house, if that opening of the oven, the womb of the oven actually accepts the guest, then they accept it in the household. They're one of us, their family. And at that point in time, the guest has a free reign in the house. They're treated as a family member would be treated, as an honored, cherished family member would be treated. So door's a boundary. There's a lot of interesting ways, even today, that are used to guard the door. I mean, you guys have all seen the idea of a horseshoe being hung over the entranceway. In a lot of belief systems, they believe to drive off anything that is pre-iron made. So usually certain creatures are not very happy with iron, and that's why horseshoe is, as a symbol of a smith, as a symbol of civilization, tends to drive away evil spirits. Some other ways, for example, there's burying certain kinds of herbs. I know that in native, some of the native believes it's sage that is either hung around the entrance, is buried under the entrance. Also, in a lot of Russian folklore, there's the idea of taking either a silver or an iron knife and sticking it over the threshold, over the door of the entranceway to keep evil spirits, non-human entities, from entering. Now, windows in Slavic tradition were very, very, very late. If we think back to more traditional cultures, early houses did not have windows. Moreover, even when you get to times such as classical period, if you think about a traditional Roman house, if you look at Pompeii, for example, if you look at Herculaneum, if you look at private dwellings, you will not see any windows facing out to the street. That's because a window is something that's very useful for defending yourself, right? Because now it opens up your ability to see around you. Like originally, the doors were oftentimes oriented south so that you could get better light and more warmth there, or east, depending on. But with the window, you have more options to observe what's around you. But by the same token, somebody walking by can also poke their head in and look at you. And that's not a good idea. It's not only not a good idea because your neighbors may see whether or not you're home and rob you, but because evil spirits can look in on you and do evil things to you and your family. I'm never bringing the Shen again. He's sitting home again from now on. Come here, you. He's going to be our house spirit. Come here, house spirit. Let me just finish the window thing real quick. So the windows in the Slavic tradition, once they got incorporated, well, an archaization of the folklore that has to do with windows and doors, a lot of the functions of the door got transferred and moved to the window, just like you were saying about removing the dead through the back of the house. In Russian tradition, for example, if the dead person is believed to be of ill nature, if the dead person, for example, is believed to be a witch or some sort of I don't know, whatever the male equivalent of the proper term for the witch is, instead of taking the dead person out through the front door, they would take them out the window, feet first rather than head first, to move their soul immediately into the afterlife, straight to the other side, without going through all the proper rituals that you would with a human being, with something that's unclean. That's what you would do. In Middle Eastern tradition and some Eastern countries, you will see interesting things. You will walk by a house, and you will either have houses with just walls around, but windows facing inwards into the little courtyard, the same in Roman tradition, for example, or you will have itty bitty little windows, or in some traditions, you'll be passing a house, you look in the window, and instead of sitting, seeing curtains and a geranium plant there, you will see like a little collage of, I don't know, stars, the Holy Family, some sort of religious theme, so that any ghost, any monster, any other passing by cannot look in onto your privacy, onto your soul. They're looking at this picture you're presenting to them. So that's about windows and doors. Now, I'm going to go ahead and let David jump on.
Just wanted to mention I posted, I don't know if it'll open in chat, the oldest form of Slavic house, or one of the oldest forms. This one's more to the steppe river valleys, but it dates back to around the turn of the millennium to the second century, up until probably the Avar invasions in the 6th century. And it's one of the forms of Slavic house that the one that Julie showed you evolved from. It's a simple dugout house, but it already has, and it's basically an A-frame covered with turf. But it already has the little stove, the clay stove that's clay and stone, if they could find stone. But it was, at that time, it was only about 3 foot square. But I just wanted to point out that they were, from basically the time of the Goths, that underclass of proto-Slavs, if you will, up until they really took off on their own in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. Were there.
Only 3 square feet? Is that what you mean to say? 3 square foot?
No, it was about a 3 by 3.
Okay, 3 by 3. I was going to say, what?
Well, to carry some of this forward to modern construction parlance is still today the use of a dead man, and a dead man is essentially it's an anchoring wall, and it's still very much used.
Right.
So, and that's made its way into contemporary construction parlance.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, actually, we use them in construction, and kind of random, but maybe somebody will get a kick out of this. the whole sacrifice when a house is built, even if it's just, a chicken or a rooster, whatever. There was a most unusual thing that was buried in this building when it was built. Vintage phone books. I don't know if that means something or not.
I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure. And I know I announced this as gifts and gift giving, and I'm going to touch on that just a little bit because that goes off into a whole different tangent, and because the tradition of gift giving and gift returning, and the symbolism of gift giving and gift returning in the Western culture, modern Western culture, has been reduced to the concept of a bribe, and has lost all of its semantic, all of its social, and all of its mythological kind of core and attached concepts that traditional culture was very much built around. I'm just going to touch on that really, really quickly because we're out of time, and I think we're going to have to do at least 1 or 2 more episodes on this before we move on to anything else, if that's okay with everyone. But of course, items. Now, just like I said, a house is in a way, it's representation of a person, but it's not just representation of the person, it's representation of the head of the household. I was telling David the story that one of the anthropologists I was listening to brought from an anthropological expedition. And this was fairly recently, within the last 10, 15 years. They were visiting a very far off Siberian village, and a lonely old man was dying in his house, and he was dying a slow and bad death. Now, in far Siberian folklore, it's believed that you're talking to somebody who's practicing some sort of dark magic. If a person, especially a man, is having a hard time dying, it's a bad death, it's a hard death. It is believed it's because he needs to pass on his magic onto somebody else too. And if he has no children and no offspring, which they oftentimes don't, and he has not found a young man or woman to transfer to, he can't die until he figures out a way to do something with this power. And so the villagers at the time were there, watching him die, and that they saw that he was suffering terribly. None of them wanted to take this dark gift from him. And so one of the young men in the village climbed up to the top of the house with an axe, and he cut that axe into that supporting beam of the house. That cross beam. And the moment he did it, the man died. Now, did the man die because they stuck an axe, because they killed the house? That's up to you to decide. The ethnographers don't claim one way or another, but the matter of the fact was that the man was having a hard time dying. A kid climbed up, he ritually murdered the house, and the house's owner died with it. The same way that the house is a part of a person, it's an extension of the head of the household, so are objects in traditional cultures are an extension of themselves, of their selfhood, of their personhood. And I personally think that comes from the idea when very early on, like a wolf has, teeth, a cat has claws. A human doesn't have any of those things. So any weapons or tools you make with your hands become an extension of your body. They are you. So there's such thing as transference of identity, transference of selfness, of self, into objects that belong to a person. For example, in Slavic tradition, things like a spoon, things like a comb, things that personally belong to a person, those things, if stolen, can be used to harm that person because they like taking their body parts, like taking their nail clippings or hair clippings. And so objects that a person owns are extensions of themselves. And by giving those objects again to the visitors, they are sharing a part of they're incorporating them into their world. In other words, when you have two people exchanging gifts, they're melding their bodies. It's almost like an act of intercourse. Am I making sense? That's the very, very original, very early aspect of it. So objects, because objects were so very few in very early times of humanity, they were very, hey, no eating computer cord. The Xian. He's chewing on my cord. Yeah, he's not coming again. But because you spend so much time on making those tools, they're so very essential. Every item you give away, every arrowhead, every flint knife, every flint tool you give away, it's labor, it's spirit, it's almost a physical extension of you. So it's kind of like exchanging knives, daggers in some cultures, right? like I'm sure I don't know if that's common in the native tradition, but I know, yeah, things like that, or women exchanging their like various fabric making tools, things like that. It's like blood brotherhood. It's kind of like becoming blood brother. I mean, what's the word for it? Choice brother, for I'm saying, when two men bond, and it's almost like swapping blood in that childish ritual. So,
I think I said before that my ex was a shaman, basically, and she would have me go places and drop like my beard hairs or something, and she could act through that because we were connected, and that was what her belief was.
moreover, it's in the Slavic tradition to this day, it's considered to be exceptionally dumb. Like, if to clip your nails and leave those clippings behind you and not burn them, you're stupid. You're asking for trouble.
That was exactly the same in her northern native tradition. It's identical.
So that's a very archaic belief system. Very,
I've
very
heard that you're supposed to hide them at the very least. If you hide them, supposedly that's better.
destroy them.
Or burn them.
Destroy them some way, because if you don't burn them, either somebody who wishes you ill, or some stupid young broad who wants you to marry her, might use that for some sort of love spell. That's a pretty common story too. It gives people power over you. So when you sharing objects, so originally, before it became a part of economy of the gift exchange economy, like very early stages of it, it really was you or me, I'm you, we are one, and that sort of family incorporating ritual. And I think that's all I want to say for now. Now, David wanted to jump in with something else.
I think as long as we were qualitatively making things ourselves, that spiritual attachment was much more, or even having some local member of the community making them for us because they had specialized. I think much of the spirit went out of it when we began mass producing things, because there is, whether it's carpentry, spear making, whatever it is, canoe making, there's craftsmanship in that. And you put so much of yourself into making something like that, that there's some lingering spiritual presence to it, if you will.
And you think even nowadays people will still ask to get things blessed by a priest and in the church. That's that kind of thing. It may be vestiges of that, but the idea is still there even today.
I wanted to ask Yancy, you help me out here. I know that the totem poles of the northeastern, I know, but we touched on that too. And they're not so much of a life tree as remembrances of descent, that's correct, that are attached to the house.
I don't know too much about the Northwestern traditions, but
Right.
there are what I call family spirits that can be attached to the house.
Right.
And totem
And they were
poles,
kind of chiefdom level anyway. They were.
I know a bit about totem poles, having lived amongst the Haida and other peoples like that, and they often have the family lineage, and they have more than one hat because the number of hats shows how you are in the community. Like the chiefs will wear a hat, and there's multiple hats that are higher up. But a totem pole is designed or expected to just decay and go back into the earth, so they don't really fix them up very much. And if it does go back to the earth, that's perfectly fine. They're happy with that.
The other thing, Yahtzee, sweetgrass, sage, cedar, do the Dene peoples use it, or is that more plains?
we use sage well, growing up it was sage, and then the sweetgrass is something that came in from other cultures, but it's used for I call it purification, like a funeral.
Yeah, my ex was smudged with cedar, and there's male and female sage, tobacco, and sweetgrass. That was, and she was living amongst like the Algonquin and the Iroquois and those kinds of people. But her people, the Gwich'in, never had anything like that. And the people where I live locally, the Han people, the Kondak Gwich'in, they have nothing like that except being borrowed. Like they'll use tobacco in their ceremonies, but tobacco's not native here, not even close. So there's a lot of borrowing going on.
Yeah, and I think there is across the whole native spectrum, just because of just because it's so few people's left, really.
And then going back to the male and female part of the house, we do have in.
Uh-oh.
Oh, you froze up.
But male and female is also symbolic of duality. You know, the duality of opposites, but it's also the interchange of duality because they interact with each other. So
almost yin and yangish.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
I wanted to expand a little bit on something that you said, David, about the when we had, master craftsmen, there was a lot of labor, personal labor put into objects. There's a part of yourself goes into it. I think that might have been why traditionally, in the barter trade, agreement, okay, so I give you something, you give me something of great importance back. There's a lot of bonding going on there, so to speak. And of course, like I think it was Julie mentioned, okay, people will name things, like they will name their weapons. If you go out and you buy a modern weapon that was mass produced in a factory, it would have to be kind of customized to your liking in order to imbue it with a name, probably. Whereas before it was probably more natural to just name every one that you made. Just a thought.
Well, and really quickly before so I'm going to touch really, since Yatsi brought that up, male and female spaces. So the female spaces oftentimes in a lot of cultures are considered to be the male spaces, and pardon me for the sexism on this, but the males typically were the defenders of a family. I mean, traditionally was nothing else. If not, go ahead, Yatsi.
Oh, yeah, male, yeah, it's opposites, duality, light and darkness. So they're polar opposites, male and female. It's like the coin. If you have a coin,
right.
Male on one side, female on the other side. They're part of the same body, but they interact.
Right. And what I was going to bring that
with each other, but each has their own roles.
Right. No, I agree with you. But oftentimes, at least in Indo culture and Indo-European culture, the female spaces were not open to the guests. Bottom line is there was an area of a Greek house that was exclusively the female part of the house. And so typically when a guest arrives, the guest is welcome to the male half of the home, not the female half. Partially because the female half has a lot of sacred things associated with it, things like birth. And I don't mean just birth of children. It's birth of, for example, bread, birth of food, birth of magic. An interesting kind of almost comical story from early Soviet years. So when the Soviets were first coming to power, right in the beginning, very young, very enthusiastic Soviet commissars were running around the villages and making sure, the commissars would be running around and making sure that people were done with these superstitious religious things. There were no more icons, no more, saints in the house. And so what somehow people would do, and this worked, they would take those icons and they would hide them in that little female, the lady of the house part of the structure. And the commissars, who themselves claimed to be atheists, who themselves came from the same village peoples, basically, they would come and they would search the whole house, but they would not dare enter that female sacred space. And so those hidden icons for which these people could have gotten executed actually were never found. And this is kind of almost a comical, tragic comical story.
Yeah, it's like in Canada, traditionally the women's area is the kitchen, although that's definitely changing. And so if a couple comes to visit another couple, the women will gather in the kitchen and the men will gather in the living room, which is the more public part of the house. So it's not a private way quite like it is in the Russian idea, but it is an area that the women tend to be. And they have to be pretty close to do that. Otherwise, they stay in the living room with everybody else.
Well, right, and that's the same thing. But and that's just like that in modern day Russia, of course. But in the archaic concepts, like the idea of, and sorry, I'm pretending to be Khrushchev with the shoe on the table because the Shen is running around. But sorry. But the idea of entering that, it's kind of like the idea when like if you go into somebody's house today, you're not going to walk into their bedroom and sit on their bed, right? You're not going to even think about twice about why you're not doing that. The idea that you might be picking up some of their sexuality onto your person, the idea that you might be polluting their future conception of children, you just won't. It's in your head. It's drilled in your head. You just don't walk into this couple's bedroom and sit on their bed unless explicitly. And even that, if you're invited to do that, then you're probably about to start a threesome, right? I mean, that's not something that common. Even kids oftentimes, not once they get past a certain age, are not encouraged into that sacred household space. It's the same kind of a taboo. And as far as what Ryan was saying about mastership, in Russian language, the word for master is often, and the words for construction, even in all our languages, is oftentimes used, like, for example, let's see, to build a family, right? To build a relationship, to create, to create a community, right? To build a community. Those ideas that come with creation of things, of construction of things, of building of things are very closely tied to divinity, but they're also very closely tied to the concept of physiological conception. So, for example, in Russian rural kind of slang languages, not rural dialects, not slang, oftentimes, like somebody can say that he built onto her belly. You know what I'm saying? He mastered her belly. To the idea that the man in some way crafts the new life onto the woman. The idea that every man is in a way a creator and the woman in a way is a nourisher. That's just an interesting little side tangent, but those metaphors, to master her belly, saying those parallels are not really used as much. I'm sure they existed in older Germanic languages, but I think a lot of them have been lost in modern languages. But the echoes of that stuff still remains, because the idea of construction, of building, of creating is very much one of the most positive ideas, I think, in our culture, and the way those words are used are very positive always.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, I think that if you go a few generations back, at least in the area that I live, they would probably be a little bit more common and a little bit more understood. But yes, the idea that the male is a creative force is kind of old. It's kind of common.
Yeah, like the child is crafted almost. The concept of Pinocchio comes from that same idea, for example. An echo in Western fairy tales is the idea of Pinocchio, to where you have a man who is a craftsman, right? He's a woodworksman, and he builds a child out of wood, for example. And there's a lot of fairy tales like that, I think, not just in Indo-European cultures, but also in other cultural systems. But I think that's everything I have to say. We went 30 minutes over time, and I'm going to let everybody go politely now.
So just to share a story,
Mm-hmm.
and it kind of touches on a lot of what we've discussed tonight, and it's craftsmanship, gift giving, blades, coins, and this was taught to me by a mentor of mine when I worked on the East Coast, Bob Tomlin, and he said, when you gift someone a knife or a blade, you always gift it with a coin, with a piece of copper, and you do that a penny, a copper penny. So the person that you're gifting this blade to does not cut themselves or injure themselves with their gift.
In Russian culture, very similar. You always, if I'm going to give you either a knife or soap, for that matter, you pay me a penny. So it's technically not a gift for exact same reason. Because knife is dangerous. It's got, you know what I'm saying? And soap is slippery and it has its other mythological attachments, but those are two items you just don't ever give a person, either blade or, unless you have two warriors exchanging weapons, which is a whole different conversation. And guys, if anybody else has like their own cultural background, to jump in, I really wanted to go over some of these very base concepts that we almost never think about and that are mostly lost in a lot of Western tradition just because of an overlay of Romanization, Christianization, everything else. But I think a lot of these are very root concepts: the idea of a threshold, the idea of a hostile outside world and an internal microcosm, the idea of house being the extension of the person, and the house being alive and it's having a spirit that's hostile to outsiders, that sort of thing. So I really wanted to cover that.
Well, I think that we mostly all agreed that it's going to take more than one episode to cover hospitality, gift exchanges, that type of thing. I have a few stories from my own life that I think are related, but another time when we have more time.
Yeah, and we will. And if we go into gift giving, I'm going to go into slowly everything from feeding to bribes, and you'll learn a lot of interesting things about our anti-corruption laws and so forth, and their methodological nonsense, exploitation of the very archaic concepts, and exploitation of the fighting with the very archaic concepts of the Eastern cultural traditions.
Yeah, and would love to hear your stories, Ryan.
Oh, Ryan, and we would love to hear your story, please, because any personal story, like I said, if anybody has anything to contribute, whether just cultural overview or, just personal experience, that's awesome, because I think we all have a lot of interesting. That's what I love about this group. Everybody has something interesting to contribute, and that's what makes it interesting for everybody.
I didn't think that I was the only one who could tell a good story about hospitality, but I thought that you might get a kick out of my story because some of the people involved, they were also Russian American.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing it. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Good to see everybody. Everybody be well. Thanks.
Take care. Bye, everybody. Bye.
That exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes.